Hi, this is Paul. I've finished up the book Vatican I. Very interesting book. Very interesting reading this book in the light of the papal conclave. I watched some of Kale and Larry's live stream this morning. Also, when just before I was waiting for Martin Shaw to come in, I took a look at some of this where they had the Cardinals procession and just a few comments on some of the things that were said. Bishop Barron was here on the mic.
George again, who was a great mentor to me, and his famous meditation when he came out, next to was Joseph Ratzinger, and he had this very pensive look on his face, and people asked him, "What were you thinking about?" And he said, "I was thinking that, Nero's empire, it's long gone, it's turned to dust, but here's Peter's successor right next to me, waving at the crowds, and the endurance of the church across the ages is a great mystery." I don't care who you are, what your faith is. It's a great mystery, the endurance of the church. And the fact that Peter's, 266th successor is about to emerge, that's in itself an amazing thing.
We've been talking. Please go
We're
ahead.
proclaiming this year for this 17th century, the Nicene Creed, and at the end, we talk about the holiness of the church, and that's not the holiness primarily of us. It's God's holiness working through the church, and that is the reason why the church has survived. There was the great episode of Cardinal Consalvi, the Secretary of State, with Napoleon, when Napoleon said, "I will destroy your church." And he said, "If bad popes and sinners within haven't done so in the previous 18th century, how do you think you're going to
you
do
poor
it?"
little man, didn't he say?
Yes, he did.
So many have tried.
And that's a great comment. He doesn't say that Napoleon, in fact, invaded Rome and imprisoned the Pope, and the Pope died in prison in France. I'm learning my papal history. If I recall correctly, it was Pius the Sixth. Pius the Ninth then would be the Pope over Vatican I, which is of course the portion of the book that I'm reading. And Vatican I ends because it's adjourned, but it isn't really concluded, as Cal noted to me a while ago. It isn't really concluded because the forces of Italian unification invaded the Papal States. As I mentioned in my last video about this, the Papal States were notoriously poorly run, and they were in fact in revolt more times than one. Pope Pius IX was trying to get France to... Vatican I is such an interesting story because it's a story about I'm reading John O'Malley's take on it, his book on it. He's a Roman Catholic priest. He's a church history expert. I'm sure those who know more about church history and Vatican history in particular, and Roman Catholic history, would have more color in terms of the particular color that he gives to it. But it's this struggle between the episcopacy. What do I mean by that? The bishops in different regions, and those bishops in different regions in their relationship to the church, and how those people became bishops, in a sense where this is just so complicated in terms of what the imagined lines of authority are. And so what happens in Vatican I is you have papal primacy and papal infallibility that get brought into official teaching of the church in Vatican I. And then the Vatican I has to be adjourned. Pius gave bishops permission to leave Rome. He did not consider the council adjourned, although just a little over 100 fathers remained in the city. They carried on for 3 more general congregations, August 13, 23, and September 1, with little to show for their effort. By then, the French troops had already withdrawn from cities and towns from which they had defended Rome. Meanwhile, September 1 and 2, the French suffered their decisive defeat at the hands of the Prussians in the Battle of Sedan, during which Napoleon III was taken prisoner. The war dragged on for a few more months under the provisional French government, but then there was no way the French could recover. That's the Franco-Prussian War. The result for Rome was inevitable. On September 8, the Italian forces began their offensive, with Rome the ultimate prize. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel. And if you go to Rome, there's this enormous monument that overlooks the Roman Forum. It's just this astoundingly huge, impressive monument, which clearly was built right there on the site, or right next to the site of the Forum, to make a point. Of course, one of the big struggles that you can see in Vatican I is a struggle that will continue on from the 19th into the 20th century, and in some ways into the 21st century, which is the struggle with nationalism. And this question of, okay, you have St. Peter's successor, what on earth do we mean by the church? What is the church? This is a question that the Reformation really brought to the fore. Question that, okay, well, you've got this Pope. And another thing that struck me in the conclave in this video was, let's see if I can pull up the
We have been talking somewhat in the abstract for several weeks now about how diverse the College of Cardinals is, how universal it is. Well, we just witnessed in the oath-taking the universality of the Church. We have 133 cardinal electors out of 252 from so many different corners of the world. So many of them are first-time countries with a cardinal representing them. And to see that unfold then, that's the last time that we will see these cardinals. The next time we see them as a group, you were mentioning Cardinal George peeking out the window.
Yeah.
That is when we will see them all next. They will line the windows on either side. A reminder that here, the Universal Church, with the representatives of the cardinals, has come to Rome to elect a successor to St. Peter. The next time we see them...
Language is so tricky here. The Universal Church, these are ecumenical councils, and O'Malley reminds us that by ecumenical, they don't mean sort of these ecumenical things in the 20th century like the World Council of Churches. They mean basically the worldwide Roman Catholic Church. That's what they're thinking of. And he said, you know, the cardinals represent the church. Well, of course, in some ways the question is, well, where is the church? What is constituted by, what is the church constituted of? And this, of course, is one of the big struggles in the Protestant Reformation.
We will have a successor to Peter. And I think that's an important moment of confidence and hope that we can have.
And they will come out on the facade of St. Peter's. And architecturally, we have to take that seriously. The Church of St. Peter, the Basilica, is meant to represent the church as a whole, as Jesus gave us the architectural plans, literally built right on top of Peter. And the public face of that church is going to be the Holy Father, literally standing underneath Christ risen from the dead at the top of that penitive.
And you can just sort of see, he sort of lays out the symbolism of that and what it means.
Understanding Christ and trying to proclaim him publicly. And when the other cardinals line around him, that is where we're going to find the church.
And I hear that, and it's like, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. Because when, again, I'm deeply Protestant, when I think of the church, I think of the assembled Christians all around the world. And this, of course, is what this whole question in Vatican I was wrestling with. You know, the bishops in that sense, but then the question is, well, one question is, how are the bishops named? Who selects the bishop? And they had these concordats in Europe. Larry and Cale brought up what's going on in China in terms of, okay, who selects the bishops in China? We'll get to that as we get into Vatican I a little bit more.
Ubi, Petrus, Ibi, Ecclesia. Wherever Peter is, there is the church, and he's going to be surrounded by members of the College of Bishops from
Wherever Peter is, there is the church.
all over the planet. How beautiful that's going to be.
Can I quote Cardinal George again? I think he's inspiring me. Because I remember he said after one of the conclaves, he said, It's a time of great anxiety. The Cardinals feel great anxiety. Why? Because no one has the keys. No one has the keys. And he said, once the Pope is elected, sigh of relief. And he meant it. He meant it.
That's astounding. It's just, this language to me is just astounding. Joseph, who is preparing to become an Orthodox deacon, was in the chat during Cale and Larry's live stream, and Joseph said, "We haven't had an Archbishop of Canterbury for a year. No one seems to care." This ultramontanism that Vatican I sets up. Now, O'Malley's very interesting, because then he'll go on to lecture and write and talk about Vatican II, and Vatican II is sort of this counterweight to Vatican I, and I'm not going to be, I want to be careful and respectful for my Catholic friends, but it's interesting the way these things sort of move back and forth. So the Italian troops are taking Rome, but as the Italians advanced, Pius had to come to terms with reality. In yesterday's video where I talked about the parish manifesto, Ross Bird, his conversation with Ethan Cawhey, it's so interesting how, and I sort of talked about the way that church and state were sort of wedded. And of course, in America, these two things come apart. And this is the divorce that in some ways is happening and forced to happen by nationalism and the creation of the nation state of Italy in taking Rome, taking the Papal States. So Pius had to come to terms with reality. He now had to decide whether to use his papal army to defend the city. He vacillated, even though his Secretary of State, Antonelli, strongly opposed any military resistance. At the last minute, Pius gave way to pressure from General Hermann Kanzler, commander of the papal troops, and allowed him to engage in battle until the city wall was breached and the Italians were able to enter. 5 a.m, September 20, the Italians had arrived at Porta Pia and began their assault, for which the papal troops were no match. After a few hours, they broke through and claimed the city. It was a momentous event. With it, well over 1,000 years of papal history came to an end. And again, I'd read this, and then I'm listening to them. They're talking. It's just sort of like, okay, well, where is the church? What is the church? King Victor Emmanuel was installed in the papal palace at Quirinal. Pius claimed the Vatican quarter of the city, sequestered himself there, and declared himself the prisoner. And again, this is the Pope as being the prisoner of the Vatican. And that will continue until Mussolini, when the Pope and Mussolini come to an agreement. And then in the Second World War, the rise of media are incredibly important in terms of the creation of the modern Pope. What's so amazing is that when I watch myself just watch these things, it's easy, without knowing any of this history, to just sort of, you think it's always been this way. You think it's always been this way because of the costume, because of the pageantry, because of the architecture. But it hasn't always been this way. So much of this is just so absolutely new. And yet, there's sort of a, is it kayfabe? Of eternality? The new government accepted the anomalous situation and left the Pope undisturbed. Didn't do as Napoleon did and pull him out of there and drag him to France and have him die in jail there. Citizen, I forget his name. A month later, October 20, just a few weeks before the bishops were scheduled to return to Rome, Pius adjourned the council indefinitely on the grounds that it could not act in freedom. The Italian foreign minister, Emilio Visconti Venosta, immediately protested the Italian government would guarantee the council's freedom. A protest surely sincerely meant the Italians had no desire to further vilify the world press as an enemy of the Catholic Church. And, it's interesting, too, as you have the rise of the press. I've been watching the whole drama unfolding in the space that was once the IDW, where Peterson and James Lindsay are sort of being mocked and taken on by others because of, what they've said and the whole woke rights thing. And it just strikes me that a consumer press and social media simply is attracted by attention. Thus, the First Vatican Council slipped into an adjournment that within a few decades seemed destined to be everlasting. But the soft but definitive end to ecumenical councils, after all, Pastor Eternus, had rendered such gatherings obsolete. And so part of the theme of the book is the way that, in many ways, much to the protest of those who lost the votes of that ecumenical council, the fix was in. There was no way this was going to go any other way. And in fact, certain elements of the agenda were sped up because people could see the fact that it was quite likely that what happened in Rome would happen in Rome. And unless they got to the point and declared papal infallibility and papal supremacy, it wasn't going to happen. And again, it was so fascinating listening to Kale, because listening to how they are working through the interpretations of Vatican II, well, the interpretations of Vatican I is right there in terms of Vatican II, and all of these forces. Now, from the conclusion of the book, by the third chapter of the 18th century, Gallicanism, Febronianism, Josephism, Jansenism, Nationalism, and the Enlightenment had, to the papacy's great dismay, often joined forces to act in ways that defied papal claims. With the death of Pius VI in ignominious exile in France, they seemed to have, it was amazing that they mentioned Napoleon, and I thought, good grief, people. He took your pope, and your pope died in prison. And now, again, to their major point, the church did not end. But what exactly didn't end? Sorry, I'm a deeply Protestant person. It wasn't the papacy didn't end, in all fairness, but that pontiff did. But the institution rebounded to a remarkable degree. And that's true. If you read the book, you see these wild swings. After the French Revolution, much of this happens after the French Revolution. Catholicism in France is wildly popular. Churches are filled after supposedly killed by the French Revolution. It isn't killed. It rebounds. The council was, to a large degree, a reaction to the Century of Lights. Vatican I quite deliberately moved against Gallicanism. And what is Gallicanism? Gallicanism is basically the idea that I probably would get the nomenclature wrong, but the congregation of French bishops and the particularities of French Catholicism must be subservient to the papacy. That's ultramontanism. The primacy of the papacy and the infallibility of the papacy. Now that will get tweaked. With Romanticism as the silent ally of the ultramontane movement. That's so interesting. And, watching, it's almost as if we're watching the World Series or the World Cup or the NBA Finals. The television liturgy is all there. The celebrities at the desk. The color commentary. with Romanticism as the silent ally of the Ultramontane movement, which generated the council, the Ultramontanes saw the council as a statement against Jansenism. That's sort of a version of Catholicism similar to Calvinism that was quite popular in the 18th, 19th century that arose. And its ecclesiology. What do I mean by its ecclesiology? Jansenism, like Calvinism, like Protestantism, like democracy in many ways, saw the existence and legitimacy of the church as based in the congregation of the people, of the body of Christ. And in some ways, you've got this question, what is the body of Christ? Is the body of Christ in the air of St. Peter in Rome, or is the body of Christ in the pews and in the seats and among the people gathered? In Germany and elsewhere, Catholics looked to the papacy for protection against the intrusion of their religious for the intrusion into their religious practice of governments energized by nationalist fever, a protection that seemingly local bishops could not provide. Bishops, it seems, would often be susceptible to, well, susceptible, they were sometimes named by the king or the emperor or others within, again, an American imaginary within the civil system. And this, of course, is what Cale and Larry were complaining about in terms of China. And the idea was, well, what if we invest, if all of them have to be accountable to the papacy, and that, of course, fuels, well, what do you want from the papacy? Will the Pope act against, German synods? Will the Pope act against Roman Catholics in high American office who propose birth control and abortion, etc., etc.? Moreover, Pius IX and many others received the council from the beginning as a negative response to the modern world, the world in whose creation the Enlightenment had played such an important role. And it's so interesting to listen to all the Enlightenment anxiety. I talk about the recession of modernity. Jordan Peterson talks about the counter-Enlightenment. The Pope meant the council to be a solemn reaffirmation of the Syllabus of Errors. Now, the Syllabus of Errors is this document that basically denounces the elements of liberalism that are in some ways battled now, but it's difficult for me to see any party on the current playing field that doesn't, at least in some ways, rely and depend upon freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and in fact, some version of representative democracy. That comprehensive rejection of modernity. The council certainly did not go that far, but De Filius, it proclaimed with De Filius, it proclaimed the reality of the spiritual and supernatural against the materialism and rationalism that marked the 19th century. Pastor Eternus, in no uncertain terms, made it clear the validity of monarchy and its sovereign ability to counter modern skepticism. As Ulrich Horst observed, the majority at the council acted out of anxiety-ridden defensiveness that was, above all, fixated on guaranteeing certainty in a world in which the certainties that the church and society had taken for granted for centuries were crumbling. For all that, the council was a remarkably modern happening. And I know the term tar baby is... and when I think of a tar baby, I think of this Brer Rabbit story where Brer Rabbit tries to fight the tar baby, but if you hit it, you get stuck to it. And actually, Martin Shaw had a story of sticky hair, which is basically the same type of story, that the more the church the elements of modernity were simply unavoidable. And in many of the ways, as we'll see, the elements that Protestantism brings to the world, deny it on one hand, but there's a performative contradiction in the way that you're denying it, and you're just wrapping yourself in it. And this is part of the point that he makes. The participation of the bishops from the remotest parts of the world became possible only through modern means of transportation. On a deeper level, the centralization of authority that Pastori Ternus promoted was a phenomenon that in the secular sphere had greatly accelerated in the 19th century. It resulted in a very modern standardization of procedures on a worldwide basis. In other words, in order to sort of resist the particularities that would be natural in France and Germany and Ireland and Spain and all of these places, there's sort of an organic, natural particularity in all of these places just by virtue of how history works. Now suddenly more uniformity. It's deeply modern. Again, listening to someone like Richard Rowland when he's talking about when he's sort of going back, studying past centuries in places like England, discovering that, before a certain period of time, many of these churches in Western Europe looked a lot like what he sort of found in Orthodox places in Eastern Europe. I talked again with Martin Shaw about that today as well. Because it's almost as if the different areas carved out by just where different waves of history went through and where they didn't. In some ways, the Orthodox Church comes here untouched by these things, but they won't be untouched by these things by participating here and now. Once you get into this, there's no not being a part of it. It resulted in the modern standardization of procedures on a worldwide basis, as is most obvious to the Church in the gradual elimination or significant diminution of local liturgical practices. In other words, to fight Gallicanism, you have a uniformity of liturgy, because we don't want the French liturgy developing its own narrative line, because they develop their own narrative, their own liturgy. They'll be distinct from the Italian, distinct from the German, distinct from the English, distinct from the Spanish. Can't have that, because soon they'll be governing them. They'll be de facto governing themselves, and if they're governing themselves, to what degree will the King of France be actually governing them, or one of the Emperor Napoleons? At the same time, it is called people out of their provincialism and nationalism and force them into a more expansive vision of the church and consequently of the world. It unwittingly further eroded the confessional state model. Okay. So this confessional state model has a co-laboring between prince and bishop. Now suddenly, all the Vatican as the Secretary of State and will act as an independent nation, and what that does is sort of it reinforces this line between the religious and the secular. The council was modern in that it resulted from a campaign carried on in a press whose impact was made possible by the development of fast, reliably inexpensive means of printing and distribution, on a grand scale. Without the combat that was going on in the press, you wouldn't have generated the interest to fight this fight for papal infallibility and papal supremacy. The council was modern in that on the world stage, a characteristically modern method of arguing confronted more traditional ones. By and large, the majority of the council argued by lifting proof texts from authorities, unchanging and unchangeable. It's not sort of authority from below. It's Platonic, formal, never changing, unchanging authority from above. Which most often and most poignantly were verses from the New Testament. And that's basically how Protestants were working. The council moved at a level above the irrelevancies of the contingent, at the same time interpreting text with judicial categories unknown to the biblical writers. The minority tended to be more historical and empirical in its approach, a reflection of a phenomenon long in the making that reached such a culmination by the time of the council as to be a striking characteristic of the culture of the 19th century. If you continue following him through, he'll basically say, well, they were in the minority in this council in Vatican I. They were in a majority in Vatican II, but of course you had to sort of make it look seamless because, of course, it's eternal, unchanging. So some of the groups that lost, they tried to resist. There was a fear of a schism, but eventually it didn't amount to much. By May 1872, Bismarck had his Kulturkampf, which was, again, in some ways to push the church back in Germany. When you had Bismarck doing that, of course, in unified Germany, now suddenly some of the Germans that were reluctant, then of course the German bishops, now having Vatican I, can then look to that as, okay, well, now the German bishops taught that the primacy and infallibility of the council's decree was not a new teaching. The church reaffirmed it to clarify it and to counter the errors of Gallicanism, Jansenism, and Febronianism. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, not the bishop of any other diocese, yet he must see to it that other bishops properly perform their duties. The Pope is not an absolute sovereign because he is bound by divine law and by the commission Christ gave to the church. As does the Pope, so does each bishop have his rights and duties, which are the same now as before the decree. To say that bishops are now agents of the Pope is utterly misunderstand the decree. With one more touch of sarcasm, the document reminded Bismarck that the immoral and despotic principle that a superior must under all circumstances be obeyed was not to be found in the Catholic Church. Bismarck was not the only important statesman to take a public stance against Pastor Eternus. In 1874, Gladstone published the Vatican decrees in their bearing on civil allegiance and sold 140,000 copies. So, of course, this had implications in terms of what the rulers of Europe would think. Gradually, therefore, a consensus emerged that softened the hard edges of the differing interpretations. The minority lost the battle in the council, but in the reception process afterwards, it regained a little ground. Controversy over infallibility continued, but it was, as before the ultramontane movement, generally confined to the borders of the academy. There were occasions, however, when it again burst onto the public square, as for instance in the United States in 1960 with the nomination of John Kennedy to the presidency. It was not primarily infallibility, but primacy that after 1870 had the great and more immediate impact that led to the biggest changes in Catholicism. There were changes that promoted more ultramontane church. Of absolute capital importance in that regard was the almost untrammeled the Concordats, like the French Concordat, allowed governments rights in episcopal nominations more or less the same as those prevailed during the old regime. That arrangement began to fail in the latter half of the century, when in 1860 the new Italian nation absorbed into itself the other political units. The Concordats with those units automatically became dead letters. Unilateral laws of guarantees, which after 1871 regulated relations between Italian government and Catholic Church, gave the Pope a relatively free hand in naming bishops and required the state only a so be it before they could occupy their see and receive their salary. This led to conflicts, but it did not prevent popes from choosing whomever they wished. So in other words, again, a key element of the Protestant Reformation that the state, well, at least for the Dutch Christian Reformed Church, who names, it's not, you're not going to buy and sell ecclesiastical offices. Again, the American system eventually will sort of become the de facto world system. It's not quite right. Between October 1871 and the following May, Pius chose 102 new bishops who filled half the dioceses of Italy. No pope had ever been given anything even remotely approaching that opportunity. What happened in Italy was a harbinger of things to come. When in 1905 the French government unilaterally abrogated the Concordat in force since 1801, Pius X denounced this act but found himself free from restraint in naming as bishops whomever he wished. And so it went in other countries as political situations continued to change. In this regard, in other words, as separation of church and state became normal, more normalized in the place that Catholic Christendom used to be, the Pope de facto had more power. But then again, as I was talking about with the Ross Bird video, the power then shifts sort of through democracy. To what degree can the church influence votes? And this is exactly what you see, for example, in the United States with all to the degree that religion comes up in the secular press, it's all about the question of how is this going to affect the vote? And then this takes on the weather within churches, because all the fighting is in the Christian Reformed Church. It has been when Trump was elected, aghast at how many Christian Reformed people could have voted for Trump. And what we need to do is to have the church, well, they can't officially back a political candidate, but we can say everything that a political candidate should be so obvious it's to everyone who they should vote, and make sure the church leans in there and has everybody vote the right way. And so it went in other countries as political situations continued to change. In this regard, and in many others, the loss of Rome and the Papal States turned out to be a happy and fruitful tragedy for the papacy. By the third quarter of the 20th century, the papacy had virtually unlimited sway in episcopal nominations throughout the world. This was a change of seismic proportions. Aside from its other ramifications, it made a more monochrome episcopacy that was more docile in all spheres. Beginning with Pius IX, the popes achieved a striking new prominence in Catholic consciousness. Now again, look at the proceedings today. For the ordinary believer, the telegraph and the laying of transatlantic cable in 1866 enabled Catholics to follow the plight of the prisoner of the Vatican, almost as it delivered, and that plight aroused their concern and sympathy worldwide. So, the Pope is a victim against the mean nation states. The invention of photography allowed those of even modest means to hang a picture of Pius IX and his successor in their living rooms. They now knew the Pope's name and recognized his face. In other words, it's not really an icon, but it's kind of an icon. An almost personal devotion to the Pope became a new Catholic virtue. Catholics grew loyal to the Pope in ways and to a degree unthinkable in previous centuries. Their loyalty and devotion found reinforcement in another new phenomena. Of the 10 popes who had died since Pius IX in 1878, 3 had been canonized, and others had their cause for canonization introduced. Up to that time, the last pope to be canonized was Pius V in 1712, and before that, Gregory VII in 1605. In times of bullet trains, jet planes, pope mobiles accorded the Pope a visibility incomparably greater than ever before. Popes became international celebrities for whom great cities became a stop when they visited. For those who cared to watch, television brought papal visits and papal ceremonies into their homes, and around the world there were many who cared to do so. In recent decades, on Wednesdays throughout the year, thousands of pilgrims have gathered in St. Peter's Square in Rome to see the Pope and hear him speak during the weekly audience. In 1870, the popes had lost Rome. Yet any visitor to the city today cannot escape the impression that the most prominent presence there is not the Prime Minister of Italy or the President of the Republic, but the successor to the erstwhile prisoner of the Vatican. Meanwhile, the Ultramontane movement, culminating in the definition of infallibility, gave impetus to a remarkable increase in the number of documents emanating from the Roman Curia. These contain teachings, regulations, warnings of almost every aspect of Catholic belief and practice. Again, this is sort of the standardization, and you sort of have, now the church is able to have way more control, sort of. It's more mind control or consciousness control. And again, during the papacies under Mussolini, or during Mussolini, they were hoping, and with Franco, with these fascistic reign, they were hoping to collaborate with the state, because that was the old dance, and have them work together. And of course, even in the United States with the main line, there was a degree of that. But again, in democracy, it tends to be filtered through the consciousness of the people. And of course, well, it's such a fascinating history. Among these documents, encyclicals came to hold a pride of place and achieve, it seems, even greater binding force. During his 22-year pontificate, Pius VII, in the early years of the 19th century, issued one. Just a few decades later, Pius IX issued 38. His successor, Leo XIII, issued 75. Important though those encyclicals were, there was only one form of document that the popes produce in ever-increasing number. In the first half of the 20th century, Pius XI was the pope, which the phenomenon became noticeable. His speeches and other communications filled 6 volumes of some 400 pages each. His successor, Pius XII, took a pontificate only slightly longer, more than tripled that number with 20 such volumes. Succeeding popes have not slackened the pace. In his long pontificate, John Paul II produced only 14 encyclicals, a modest number by modern standards, but the flow of other documents from him, such as apostolic exhortations, apostolic letters, apostolic constitutions, was considerable, to say nothing of his homilies and other speeches. The definitions of primacy and infallibility at Vatican I provide the momentum for the making of the ultramontane church of contemporary Roman Catholicism. Indeed, they now quite properly serve as icons for the phenomenon. Nonetheless, they are only one factor, though a crucial one, in the convergence of factors that resulted in the current situation. After all, the genesis and ultimate success of the ultramontane movement were also the results of a convergence of factors. That's how history works. And then, of course, when you get into Vatican II, well, the modern church is right there, and now some figuring out how to live with modernity has to be figured out. But things are going to move quickly, so by the time the 1960s rolls around and they're wrestling with basically the end of the Second World War, the rise and supremacy of democracy in the West, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And they're still figuring out what that looks like. Maybe I'll put a clip from my conversation with Martin in here, because, of course, these aren't just Catholic issues. Again and again, I tend to hear this is basically common for Protestant conversations. It's the church and it's the culture. Well, the culture is not such an easy thing to separate from the rest of my life and have it go sit in the corner. It's all around us. We're communicating through it. We're fighting each other with it. I see that in the Christian Reformed Church, where, again, thinking about an observation that Jordan Hall made with respect to communication styles, the Democratic Party sort of reached ascendancy in the culture in the time of mass culture. And then Donald Trump was sort of the social media president in many, many ways. The Abide movement using social media basically took down what had been the hegemons of the Christian Reformed Church with basically very little organization and no money, just using social media tools, as compared with the denominational printing press and all of the official denominational elements. So what is the church? To watch something like this on TV, I mean, you just, you almost get the sense that this is made for TV. Cale made a really interesting observation. I can't find it quickly. A transcription hasn't happened yet. But Cale made the point that when Francis came into office, there wasn't this sort of resistance machinery, traditionalist resistance machinery in social media, in blogs. Of course, I first met Cale through a piece that he wrote in Steve Skojek's blog, Steve Skojek, who has now left the faith, and blogs and YouTube channels and this entire media community that sort of arose in resistance under Francis. That's all there. And when the new pope is revealed, immediately they're going to scour what has he done in the past? What is his reputation? What is he going to do? And he's going to be watched like nothing else. But that's, in a sense, the platform upon which the modern papacy must operate. Again, can you imagine something? Just look at the camera work. You would imagine that this is made for a movie. In fact, of course, they're making movies of this. The costume, the decoration, the pageantry, the seriousness, the sincerity, the earnestness. The color commentary, the explanation, which I'm participating in all of this. Well, what do you have to say? I just finished reading the book Vatican I because both in terms of trying to understand what's happening in this Orthodox moment and trying to figure out what on earth the Roman Catholic Church is, I thought, well, Catholicism, because I had first read a couple of books about Pius the XI and Pius the XII during the Second World War, and come to understand that the democracy was evil, and Mussolini for Pius the XI didn't quite trust him, but he really hoped that Mussolini could work well with the papacy because they'd lost their papal states, and hoping that they could make Catholicism great again. And of course, Mussolini didn't work out real well. Franco, that was interesting. And Hitler was just a catastrophe right from the start, even though he's from Catholic Austria. And so, of course, in the 20th century, then with Vatican II, the Catholic Church has to pivot again because suddenly they need the democracies, they need the Americas. And then, as this book is weaving through the legacy of Vatican I, it was so interesting because one of the things that after the Pope lost all of his temporal power over the papal states is the temporal power that he had had through his relationships with monarchs and emperors. Ironically, in some ways, the Pope became more powerful. And just as I was waiting for you to come on, of course, we have, just like sportscasting, and Bishop Barron was right there,
Yeah.
live
Yeah.
play-by-play as we go into
Yeah.
the conclave. And what was interesting was that even as in Vatican I, the papacy tries to, it declares infallibility, primacy, and not everyone is convinced. In some ways, the papacy has more primacy because of the tools of modernity. And I think about this with respect to, so two of the biggest alarmists that I read are Orthodox. They're Rod Dreher and Paul Kingsnorth, and I read them, faithfully. And Rod is rather alarmist about, on one hand, he's saying reenchantment is coming, but he's also very anxious about, let's say, unauthorized spirits, we'll say it that way, or unauthorized Elohim or unmapped Elohim.
Yeah.
And Paul, of course, is very anxious, and rightly so, about the machine.
Yeah.
But, and this is part of the reason why I've appreciated a lot of what you've been writing about the desert.
Mhm.
The we're dealing with elements that are, as this amazing image that comes from Uncle Remus, a tar baby. In that, in Vatican I, as Pius the Ninth attempts to destroy modernity, or at least preserve the church from it, he unwittingly is just, the press begins to rise in the 19th century. Of course, once photography comes into play, you have pictures of the Pope in every good Catholic place. You have, suddenly now the papacy, whereas in the 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th century, if you weren't terribly ecclesiastically plugged in, the Pope was almost nothing compared to your local bishop or your local church. And so we're in this moment when technology, the machine, it's like a tar baby. People try to fight it and they discover that once you touch it, and it's in some ways, we're at many points like that right now. And as I watch orthodoxy, where would these hundreds, who knows the numbers, would these many, many young men be streaming into Orthodox churches without the tar baby of the internet? And whereas in some ways, for all sorts of reasons, Orthodoxy was shielded from so much of the machine for
Yeah.
so long. And now it's almost, I wonder if to some degree the machine isn't sort of a novel virus for the Orthodox immune system. That, to what degree has it, and that's a blessing for the church now, because I see Orthodoxy coming in some ways like a virgin, like a maiden, like an innocent. But in other
Yeah.
ways, she's coming into a very worldly space with the machine. So there's a little rant for you. I'm really
It's a
curious to
no,
hear you take off with
it's a
that.
yeah, that's a wonderful riff, and it landed in two or three very interesting places. Um, let me just give just say a few very simple things about my own experience of what I think orthodoxy is. I think for anybody that's really a lifer, orthodoxy just becomes the place where you live. It is just the place where you live. It's that very old Christian idea of, follower of the way. Uh, it is asceticism. Asceticism is part of orthodoxy, but it's not the whole thing. But in an emergency like 2025, the response is going to get more and more extreme, you see, to the tar baby. So orthodoxy, something that, is certainly not an experience of the Enlightenment. We haven't had one. We're the Endarkenment. We're the we're very open. That is one of the great things about the Orthodox experience. You think it's rules all over the place, and you get in, and it's colossally mysterious, and nobody's trying to tidy that up particularly. So interestingly, artistically, it's much more spacious than it looks from the outside. What else would I want to say? The liturgy comes from the choreography of Second Temple Judaism. A decent Orthodox is just trying to be a good Jew.
Yeah, yeah.
We're trying to be a good Jew who has experienced grace. That's paraphrasing in our talk of passing. And that really comes from my friend Charles Foster. So I'm sort of that, but now it came from me and it's going to be from you in about an hour. We're all trying to be good Jews. And the aesthetic thing gains traction in the 3rd century. And it has a lot of the Neoplatonic in it. And it's not without merit. And I think there's a reason why orthodoxy, the formality of it, it seems radically different and from a distance far more uncorrupted than some of the models we've worked with recently. It feels like you're going to get something didactic. It feels like you're actually going to get some instruction, and you do, but even within that instruction, because in the end it's not about the church, it's about God. It's not about, sorry, I get animated at this point. Churches, I have been through a million of them. You have. They are fallible things full of fallible creatures called human beings. But the way of the church, not just the church as a sort of fucked up institution, I still have time for it. I have to have time for it. And I can see why it's going to be Orthodoxy's moment. And I think people are ringing the alarm bells. Rod is one of them. Paul is one of them. I tell you what, though, I'll name someone else who you know extremely well. Another voice that's different tonally to them is our friend Peugeot.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a smile on Jonathan's face.
Yeah.
And Jonathan can terrify you. Jonathan will tell you how to go to hell, but you'll say, well, where do I get a ticket? That's part of I'm only here to encourage all my friends, that's what I'm about. But Peugeot, he's very Hermean. Jonathan is amazing on his feet. We did a thing together at Cambridge University once, and that's the world that I live in. But he bounced back. He bounced back. He'll have his things. So Peugeot is, I think, a good doorway. He's very unhysterical, but he can talk about myth. He can talk about the supernatural. He can talk about 2025. He has amazing amount of knowledge in him. And Jonathan, and I'd want to Richard Rollin, who I think you know.
Yeah, I know Richard.
And Father Andrew Damick and people like that. Yeah. They are part of this tremendously creative conversation that's now going on between Christians that, as you were saying, are accommodating the disturbances of 2025 and saying, okay, well, if Augustine is right, if all truth is God's truth, what are the pinpricks of eternity we see in these other myths and stories? And I would imagine that's why God decided to chuck me into the mix at this particular point.
Well, let's talk about this tar baby of technology and especially the internet, because the internet is particularly tar baby-ish because it is, I mean, it is, text could grab some things, but the internet, especially version 2, but with video and with AI, with the internet is just collecting everything, and there's something deeply troubling about that, and it is troubling almost all of the other creatures that we have come accustomed to in our modern world.
Now in Tibet there's a story called Sticky Hair. There's this demon called Sticky Hair, and if you fight Sticky Hair, you just get stuck to the thing. Sticky Hair is the Tibetan tar baby. It's a very, very old myth. And until you sit down with sticky hair in a perfect lotus position and say, what ails you? Just like you do with the Fisher King, you get nowhere as long as you fight it. Now, here's a word, you're probably familiar with this, but it's called it's in Greek, the pharmakon. And the pharmakon is the poison and the remedy at the same time. Myth never deals in one thing. It always deals in and or, and it's not a black and white affair. I always say that Jesus Christ speaks a blue feather language, and people say, well, what does that mean? And I say, well, look at a magpie. There's a black feather, there's a white feather, but tucked in the tail is the blue one. And those Cohen-like parables he uses, or when he arrives in Jerusalem, you know, in the Gospel of John, and it suddenly gets mythological and massive, before Abraham I am. He just will not, he's very rarely didactic in that way. Yeah. You know, we have a very slim bit of Jesus that we can cope with, and then there's all the weird stuff around the sides. So, in other words, what I'm getting to with the pharmakon is that I'm not going to be throwing just so we know, I'm not throwing my laptop into a lake anytime soon. I may do, but the Amish move is for me to deny a kind of wrestle that I think I'm meant to have, which is to do actually with discipline. It's just to do with the fact that you go, do you know what? On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I am simply not online, and I'm online for 3 hours. It's an invitation to limit. I'm always saying, you know, make a covenant with limit, which is an old Christian idea, for goodness sake, and then you can enjoy things more. But when it gets too extreme, and I talked to this chap I probably mentioned before, Malcolm Guite, who you should talk to. He's amazing. Mind like a prairie, Malcolm. It just goes on and on and on. But he would be the same. He'd say, as soon as you are just retreating to the desert and that's it, you've lost some of the invitation to life. You know, it's not as if the desert fathers were not Gnostic. They weren't. It's not Gnosticism. But if you're not careful and you don't have the cradle of something like Christianity around you, it's going to breed that, because you are so far out now where the buses don't park. Anyway, thought for the day.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th, in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss, with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.
Get away! Get away! Get away, Chili Jordan! I wanna cross over and see my Lord. Get away! Get away! Get away! Oh, Chili Jordan, wanna cross over and see my Lord. Well, you know, I promised the Lord if he would set me free, well, I'd go until I find out what the end might be. Well, you know, one day, I was walking along, heard a voice, but I saw no one. The voice I heard sounded so sweet, child. It came down from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Well, get away. Get away. Get back, Chili Jack. Wanna cross over to see my Lord. Well, you know, one of these days, and it won't be long, you're gonna look for me, I'll be gone. Yeah, just a few more risings and setting of the sun. This old battle fought and a victory won. Well, you know, friends I used to love so dear, they gone on to glory and left me here. My feet get cold, my eyes shut, my body's been chilled by the hand of death. You know, tongue glued to the roof of my mouth, folded hands across my breast. You don't have to worry about the way I felt. Sonny Man told me he'd be right there. Yeah, my buddy Wings of Love, carrying my soul to heavens up above. They tell me Jordan is deep and wide, but I told my mother I'd see her on the other side. Get away. Get away. Oh, get back, Chili Jack.